Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Comic Source. I'm your host, Jace. We're here today to talk about a Mad Cave book from their Maverick imprint for young adults. The book is called Navigating with You, and I have the writer of the book, Jeremy Whitley, joining me to talk about it. Jeremy, thanks for taking the time.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So, everybody, this book is already out there. It came out August 6th. It's available. I give it my highest possible recommendation. It is such an amazing book, and we're going to get into it.
Thank you.
But before we get there, Jeremy, why don't you let everybody know what's the elevator pitch? How do you describe this book to people?
Uh, it's a great time to ask because I just did three conventions back to back, so I'm really good at that. It's a romance about two fish out of water high school students who've recently moved to the same school who fall in love over shared love of obscure manga.
Yeah, and it's so good, everybody, right? Like you hear that, it's two female high school students. I'm a 50-year-old white guy, probably not for me, what have you. And so, you know, interest of full disclosure, Mad Cave reached out to me. Jeremy's somebody I've been a fan of. I've never had him on the show. So they asked me if I wanted to cover this. I had no idea what it was about. I said, okay, yeah, sure. Why not? Why not have him on? So I started reading it, and I'm like, two or three pages in, and I'm like, okay, I can tell it's a technically well put together book, but maybe this is not for me, and that's okay. But let's just, keep reading. Oh my God, I was so in. I was so in. Uh, I had the feels. I had a little tissue right here. I'm dabbing my eyes at points. It's so heartfelt. It's so good. And Jeremy doesn't know this. So I have a 12-year-old daughter, and she was busy like all weekend or whatever. She didn't have time. So she finally gets home at like 9 o'clock, jumps in the shower. She goes in her room. It's like 10 o'clock. I take the iPad in there, and I'm like, okay, I know it's late. You need to get to sleep, but I'm kind of curious. I want your opinion. I read this graphic novel, and I didn't tell her anything other than that. I said, and it's so good, and I wanted her opinion as like a 12-year-old girl, like what she would think of it. And she's like, "Oh, Dad, I'm so tired. I'm so tired." And I'm like, you don't have to read it all. Just a couple pages and tell me what you think." She comes out of her room about 11, and she goes, "Yeah." So I told myself I was only going to read half of it, but I ended up reading the whole thing. It was so good. And then we talked about it like the whole drive to school and everything. And I asked her, what she liked about it, what really spoke to her, and she said she just really liked the characters. The characterization was great, and it was great to see them sort of have their journey and fall in love. But the other thing that she mentioned, and this is where I think you just excelled, and I want to get into this, Jeremy, of how you did this. She said the characters felt so real. They felt so authentic. So, I mean, you're obviously not a high school girl, falling in
No.
love with another high school girl. So let's start there. How do you think you found such authentic voices for these two characters?
I mean, I think the biggest thing going in with this story is I knew some of the stuff that I wanted to be true of them. I knew, I wanted both characters to be queer. I wanted, one of them to be specifically a lesbian and the other one to be bi. And I knew like I wanted to sort of have these like complicated elements of like what their lives were like, what they're dealing with on a daily basis. Because I think a lot of times that's uh, where books about kids get it wrong. They try to make them, this one thing. They're only this one thing all the time, or they don't have these other things going on in their lives, and um, they try to make the romance stuff feel like small or isolated. Um, and in this case, both of them are. I said it in the city where I live in Durham, North Carolina. So I was like, I got to play around with the setting some, and I was like, I want them both sort of dealing with a lot of stuff in their lives because, they're both just coming from different places, and having them sort of have to deal with all these things at the same time and to be sort of established in their own world. Because the biggest thing is, they've all, Nisha has a disability, and Gabby has a lot of her own stuff going on that comes out throughout the story. But like, I wanted to make sure we got uh, both of them sort of like living, right? Like to actually have a full picture of what these kids are like and that they have all these things happening. Um, So it's a combination of that and the fact that I think that uh, when I tend to listen a lot, I have a teen girl myself. I have two girls. Um, so I steal from them all the time. Um, but then also like, uh, I have readers on this. I make sure, I have a wonderful editor to begin with on this book and Lauren Height Susan, but that I also like run a lot of this stuff by other folks, including, I had a few in the special thanks specifically because of things like Nisha's disability. I wanted to make sure we got elements of that right. Um, and sort of included that stuff in the story without making it specifically all about her disability. Um, and that was the biggest thing for me is to let these teenagers be complicated and full of emotions without like it having to be just one thing. So I think there's a lot of books, especially when it comes to queer kids, that it's just like that's what it's all about. There's a lot of books about coming out and dealing with that stuff, and I think, um, you know, people continue to have lives after they come out, um, and it's interesting to like tell stories where these characters are already fully formed, they're already living their lives, and sort of jump in from this moment of like they've both had these pretty big things happen in their lives. Um, and they're approaching it very different ways as we start things up, and just sort of go from there and let them bounce off each other a bit.
Yeah, and there's a lot of sparks too, which is awesome. Start as a little bit, Nisha's like, do I want to be friends, with this person or not? A little bit of tension, a little bit of drama there, and it's sort of like not what you think of your traditional like meet cute as the saying goes, but from
Yeah.
there to friends to girlfriends, and I think it's very rewarding and satisfying as a reader, to follow that journey. You're sort of rooting for them to get together, and that's not always easy to do with romance to make it engaging that way and make it feel real. So, they always say write what you know. Um, so pulling from your own, relationship stuff when you were in high school and stuff, was there any casting back, or was it more talking to, like you said, your readers to get their experiences?
But yeah, I think some of it is they both the main characters have sort of previous relationship experience, which I think is a lot of times a thing that's sort of like lost in teen romance stuff. It's always like, oh, this is my
First love.
very first
Yeah.
girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever. Um, when that's I think by the time I got to, they're in their junior year of high school, I'd already had a couple of like relationships that, hadn't worked out or like had they ever been in a relationship, what exactly had happened with them.
Yeah.
And yeah, those are like those I think are things a lot of people, have by that time. So it felt sort of more real for them to be going through all of this, have these, past things to share as well as um the things going on. I think, I also got some of the stuff specifically for Nisha from, my CP readers, just like uh stories about like people uh just using their wheelchairs to, hang things on or using them as
Yeah.
an excuse to like go places or do things they wouldn't be allowed to do otherwise because they're like, oh, my, girlfriend is in a wheelchair here. So, um, I sort of leaned into experiences I knew about and uh, the also the relationship uh between Gabby and her I think even as you're reading the book, it's obvious like soon to be ex Josh, and this
Yeah.
is based very much around like some stuff that's happened to friends of mine as they've, tried to like figure out who they were and come out to their friends or boyfriends or whatever, and not gotten the not gotten what I would classify as like normal cool reactions
Yeah.
from guys. Um, so yeah, that's very much based on like uh stuff that I've seen people dealing with. Um yeah, I think like just getting some of the awkward feeling of high school and all the various stuff you go through there. And I think for me also like Nisha is very Nisha is very much in the romance sort of the person that I always end up being, that I'm just sort of like, oh no, I'm not really looking for a thing. I'm not after this right now. Oh, we're just friends. And then, eventually, even in the case of, my wife was just like oh yeah, it turns out, I do actually love her. Okay. I sort of got dragged into it, but I'm happy to be there once I get there.
Yeah, yeah, I can definitely relate to that for sure. But I like what you said, going back to what we were talking about before, where they have these full lives, right? Like, I totally agree with you. Like, so often, books that focus on kind of younger main characters, they're in high school or what have you, or sometimes even younger, middle school, what have you, and it's whatever the story's about, right? It's that one thing, and that's all they are. Maybe it's a story about a guy on the football team, or a girl, on the cheerleading team, or vice versa, a girl on the football team and a guy on the cheerleading team, and it's only about that one thing. And man, I can think back to how much stuff I had going on in junior high and high school, navigating relationships, family, school, extracurricular. Like, yeah, they have full lives. So I think that definitely gives a very authentic feel. The other thing that I think you really nail is you never talk down to the reader, in terms of kind of the vocabulary and the dialogue and what have you. But also, nobody ever really, unless they're purposely being condescending, Josh, they're not really talking down to each other, or sometimes there are some harsh words. But again, that's real life. So, was the scripting itself really easy for you, or was that something where you had to do several passes? Again, your readers getting involved, saying, "Well, that doesn't sound quite right." Because I feel like that's one of the hardest things to do with younger characters. Especially which you didn't do this, but I've read other books where if they're trying to use a lot of like current like slang terms, where then it ends up aging the book. But just getting the way they talk down, getting their voice down. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I write a lot of stuff that's aimed for YA and middle grades. And that's always been a thing that I've found. I think both as a reader and as a parent, I really don't like that feeling of being like somebody trying to capture the slang of the moment, or trying to like really place it in a time, even if it doesn't fit. There's a lot of, unfortunately, I sometimes call it like DreamWorksing up a thing, where a
Yeah,
lot of DreamWorks stuff will throw in like, what is the slang thing that kids are saying right now? And that it really just feels, you go back and watch it 5 years later and it's just like, oh,
cringy.
this
Yeah,
is this is aged poorly now.
yeah,
And that stuff doesn't need to be there. It might get a giggle or two in the theater or when somebody's reading the book, but I think it overall like tends to weaken the structure of the book. Um, and dialogue for me is I mean that's a lot of times my favorite part. I love writing conversations. I tend to write them too long. So I think that was the hardest part of for me, is that like I think originally when we were talking about this book with Mad Cave, they were like, we want it to be, 200 pages or less. And I think I turned in the first draft and it was almost 300.
oh my god.
And they were like, it needs to be 200. And sort of I went back and forth with Lauren, and we talked about stuff and grinded it down and cut pages here and cut pages there. And finally we got down to 220, which I believe is what the final is 220. And Mad Cave was like, okay, fine. That's close enough. Because I was like, at this point, if we take anything out, the book just gets weaker.
Right.
And like, I don't want to do that. And I understand like you guys have certain profit margins and certain price points you're trying to hit, but like, uh, making the book less good would mean that we then sell fewer copies. So I feel
Yeah.
like there's a point at which you have to be like, okay, printing a few more pages and making, a few cents less per. per issue is worth it being good enough that people are going to keep picking it up.
Yeah, I can't imagine what you could cut at this point. I mean, it is a pretty tight story, relatively for this type of, kind of romance relationship type book. It's paced pretty quickly. I mean, things move along at a pretty quick pace. So I can't imagine what you would cut at this point.
Yeah, I think at this point, for it to have been any shorter, I feel like it would have had to have been two books. Like
Yeah,
you would have had to have, I don't know, break it Christmas or something like that, and go for the rest of the year in a second book, which I do believe at one point we talked about. But that was, that's even more difficult to pull off, and I think would have been less satisfying as a read.
yeah. One of the things, other than dialogue, that can sometimes be challenging and not necessarily feel authentic is getting the look right for visuals. They're not quite adults, they're not quite children, they're in that kind of awkward, middle place. So visually, sometimes it's hard to convey, the youthfulness, but at the same time, we're dealing with sometimes some pretty, heady subjects here with, disabilities, abusive relationships. Obviously, romance can be very intense as well. You had a fantastic artist on this book, so um, the artist is Cassio Ribeiro. Everybody just did a fantastic job. Was he somebody whose work you were familiar with? Was he somebody you brought on the project? Was he someone Mad Cave suggested? How did he get involved?
So when I started working on it with Lauren, when we had, I think the script was already a good chunk of it was nailed down when we were looking at artists, and I think Lauren and I went back and forth on artists. I was saying like I've wanted somebody who could give it some color and also make the world feel lived in. And I think Lauren brought Cassio as one of the possible options to me. And Cassio, when I was looking through his stuff, what I really love is that the world feels kind of lived in. There's stuff on the counters. There's extra things going on in the background. Like everything feels very, very alive. And there's a real like depth of field to the stuff he does. And that was really what I wanted to get is this feeling of sort of like this being, real life, being a slice of life story. I that's a big thing to me is like those are some of my favorite things in movies and things in books as well, where like you can really get a feeling of like, oh yeah, somebody really lives here. Like this is what this house would look like. This is the kind of things they have laying around. Not everybody just keeps everything spick and span all the
Yeah,
time. And especially with it, being set in a very real place, that's not, uh, one of the three cities that we tend to set a ton of a ton of stories, especially romances in. I wanted it to feel as much like the real place as possible, which was an interesting challenge, even with Cassio, since Cassio is Brazilian, and we're setting this in Durham, so it's very Rio and Durham don't really look much alike.
yeah.
So yeah, I spent a lot of time running around, taking pictures of certain specific places in Durham that I sort of imagine these things being set, and sending him his way just to give him idea of what things should look like.
Yeah, no trouble for him with the beach scene, though, I imagine.
No, beach he's got, no problem. There's plenty of
Uh,
reference for that.
but in terms of going back to what I was talking about with the realism of the characters and the ages they were at, did you have ideas in your head of what Gabby and Nisha were going to look like already, or was that a back and forth collaboration between the two of you with their character design, with you and Cassio?
Uh, we went back and forth a bit. I think much more about Gabby. Nisha, I had a pretty clear idea of in my head from the beginning, because I knew a lot of things about about who I wanted that character to be going in. And I think Gabby, we played around with a bit more. I like in Cassio's uh, characterizing. He tends to like uh, do a lot more sort of stretching and squishing. People are a little more cartoony. There's a little more stylization than I think is often in my head.
Mm.
Um, So I think especially with Gabby is so expressive that like we really get a lot of that coming out in her character design and the way she looks and talks and moves and the way that even though she's a series of still pictures on a page, you can still get the feeling that she's like never really sitting still. She's always just kind of moving. I mean, it's a little bit of a stereotype about bi people that like she just can't sit in a chair normally. But that is like very much part of her character is that she's just sort of like always, always moving, always sitting on furniture in an odd way. Nisha is, I think, the same. Nisha does a thing that I used to do a lot in high school, which is lay backwards over the couch, reading a book. Yeah, which I enjoyed. And yeah, that was I think that goes a long way towards characters feeling real, them like looking real and acting real on the page. Um, it's got a little bit of sort of manga inspired stylization with emotions and stuff, but still like feels they feel very much like teenagers, and I think that really helps me feel like I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, I mean, definitely that's the word for Gabby. Definitely comes across as high energy, and I'm glad you mentioned manga because I was going to bring that up next. So again, we don't want to spoil everybody because you need to read and experience this for yourself. But there, manga does play a little bit of a role. It has to do with the title as well, navigating with you. So one of the things that helps Nisha and Gabby sort of connect is they find out early on that they have the same manga that they had read, they had started to read, but neither one of them had finished it. And so we do get a few pages from different volumes of the manga in here, and Cassio gets to illustrate those as well. Those pages are in black and white, but he gets a chance to draw in the manga style. So obviously, when you brought him on the onto the project and you give him the script and what have you, what was his reaction to that? It's okay, it's slice of life for most of the pages, but then you're going to have these interludes where you're drawing black and white manga. How did he react to that?
That was really interesting for me because when Lauren and I were talking about it, I was like, we might need to have two artists. We might need to have a different artist that can do this style,
Mm-hmm.
because uh, it is a manga style, and I think specifically sort of a '90s manga style. It's
Yep.
very very heavy with the inks, and it has some sort of peculiarities to how things are portrayed and how stuff is done. I wanted it to feel like that manga that you read at some point, you got just a random volume of, and there's little things about it that you're like, I don't really understand why, for instance, like their starships in this look like steam powered
Yeah.
like trains basically. But just little quirks like that. And so when we were talking to Cassio, one was like, well, we'll have him do some sort of test pages of the manga stuff as well, and see if he can do both. And he did a couple pages, and immediately like it was like, oh, obviously he could do both. There's no problem here. It's a very different style, I think, than the rest of the book, and he just killed it. And um, it made things a lot easier for us. We didn't have to find a whole other art team for that part of the book. Um, yeah, I was psyched to see just like how well he pulled it off and how different it looks from the rest of the stuff.
Yeah, and as far as the structure of the story, putting those interludes in, I mean, obviously, as you know, uh, it it helps inform the relationship and the growth of that relationship between Gabby and Nisha, so well. So when you conceived of this idea early on, that was something that was part of the original idea. Like, we're going to take, they're reading this together, sort of have a book club about it, and in so many ways, it kind of mirrors the growth of their relationship as they're reading this manga. Was that an integral part of the story as you originally conceived it?
Um, it's interesting because I think like I really from the moment we started pitching it, I was like, I want to see the manga. Like that is important to me because there's all these works of fiction that are about people interacting with other pieces of fiction, be it like songs or movies or TV shows or books. And I always want to see those things. And I always want those things to be like uh good or authentic to that experience because you really remember like the when they do the stuff and it feels right, but then like if they don't show you or they're hyping this band as being the best band in the world and then they turn out to kind of suck, it's a little disappointing. So I wanted to make sure those were in there, um, and I knew I wanted the like the first half of that to very much mirror, there's a relationship in the manga that very much mirrors uh, Gabby's relationship with her own boyfriend, Josh, at the beginning. And I knew for sure that I wanted that to be there. And I think some of the rest of that I discovered exactly how much it intersected with their world as we were sort of plotting it out and as I was uh, figuring out where these would land in the larger story. Um, so yeah, it was, because we shrunk it down so much, there were drafts that had a bit more of that in there. It's the same number of volumes, but in some cases it was, more pages, and then, obviously there was more stuff happening in the book and relationships that it was intersecting with. But I think like where we ended up with it, it comes to a very nice like point where both things are really working together.
Yeah, it's perfectly balanced in my mind. Again, I was so touched by it. I was surprised by it, and that was another thing that my daughter mentioned as well when she finished reading it last night. She's like, "Yeah, just I couldn't put it down. I wanted to see what was going to happen." It was kind of surprising, and it was just great to see their relationship and how you're rooting for them to get together. So, but let's talk a little bit about that. You said you just recently did 3 shows, and this has been out. It came out August 6th, so it's been out a little over a month. Have you had a chance to get feedback? What's the reaction been like?
Um, it's been great. We've got a couple of really nice reviews from some of the bigger outlets, which has really helped to sort of get it out there where people can see it. And I've had a lot of like people who have read it who have contacted me and been very excited about it. Love the book. That's always really nice because I am very much you not to ruin things that happen in this book, but there is sort of this relationship of the them to this book and then the book and them to the creator of the book, which like I have been on that side of the table a lot of times for people who felt very like strongly connected with a book I've written, be it Princeless or be it Unstoppable Wasp or even My Little Pony, stuff that's really like played a big role in their lives or affected them in some way. And having people come up and tell you that could be both incredibly intimidating, but also like very cool. And having people be excited about seeing themselves in the world and seeing themselves in a book and a story that they love is I mean it's the best part of doing this is that I get to hear from people who are um, really affected, who really love these things, and I think that's where I get to be luckier than some of my some other folks in comics who deal who are probably better known and have um, bigger stories, things that have made a larger impact on the comics market, say, but like I get to have a lot of, people who were kids or teenagers or are kids or teenagers that, come up and tell me about what a big difference this thing made or, in several instances, come up with a significant other or a best friend or something that they met through, reading these comics or cosplaying as characters or doing stuff like that. And that is such a incredible privilege of working in comics that I get to experience that with them and be a part of those people's lives.
Yeah, it's so amazing, and worldwide, right? You have people reach out on social media; they're all the way across the world. Just it happens to be the world that we live in. Technology allows that now, which is awesome. You
Yeah.
mentioned a couple of the other things that you're known for: Princeless, My Little Pony, Unstoppable Wasp. Is it fair to say this is sort of the most real or closest to reality? I guess we'd say like true reality story that you've done, and would you like to do more kind of in this vein?
Yeah, I'd say this probably is a lot. I tend to write a lot of things that have a bit of a magical or fantasy bent to them. I really enjoy writing that stuff. This was, I think, the first like story as grounded as this one is
Hmm.
that that I've written because I've written stuff characters in high school, but then at some point there's a magical whatever, be it a sword or a dog or whatever. Uh, but yeah, this was it's a bit different in that respect, and it was nice. It was a nice challenge to get to do it, and it is something I'd like to do more because I do love romance stories especially. And it's not always something that there's been room for in comics, even, as much as 10 years ago, I feel like there was no real like market for romance, nonetheless YA romance in comics. Um, Princeless was, I think, a really odd duck at the time it came out because, comics marketers didn't know what to do with a book that was aimed towards girls at that
Yeah.
point. And the market has obviously changed a lot since then, for a lot of different reasons. But like that was a tough sell then, and I feel like now we're in a much better place where, things like this are possible and have an audience and have the backing of retailers that know how to sell them, know what their audience is. Um, and yeah, I'd love to do more stuff like this. I'd love to do more with these characters. I know a lot of people have asked about that because like it's one of those things. Anytime I get to writing characters, I get to loving those characters, and so I always want to like I get to the end and I'm like, ah, I don't want to finish. I want to do more stuff with them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very satisfying story. Obviously, it ends in such a way that would leave it open for more, and I would be curious to read more. I would totally be in to read more, but I'd also be perfectly satisfied if this, because I was actually thinking about that when I finished it. I was like, huh, I wonder what they would be up to now, or if you go forward a couple years. But I'm also happy to just fill that in with my own imagination, you know. So either way, I
Yeah.
think it again, it's very satisfying. Um, but interesting to hear you say that. And one thing I want to stress everybody is just because we say, as in Jeremy's, to use a term he used, grounded in a very real story, that's not to say there's not drama. I mean, obviously there's, interpersonal drama. It is a romance. But there's other things. Jeremy mentioned right at the top how much these two young girls have been through, especially considering how young they are, things that have happened, traumatic experiences, what have you. So there's plenty of that in here too, right? So I don't think there's no action at all, because there is. So it's been fantastic chatting, Jeremy. Thank you so much for writing this. I really enjoyed it. Like I said, I couldn't wait for my daughter to read it. But as we're winding down here, anything else that you want to share with our audience?
Um, well, let's see. I'm still running around doing some conventions this year. If you haven't run into me yet, I will be at I'm doing Madison and Baltimore here in September, and then I'll be doing New York Comic Con in October. So you can catch me out in the wild. You can follow me online. I think the only thing that I have actually announced that's coming up right now is I have a My Little Pony miniseries that's launching later this month called The Storm in Zephyr Heights, which is my first shot at writing the modern fifth generation My Little Pony characters. So, but if that's a thing that people are into, they should definitely check that out because that one is a lot of fun. And other than that, people can actually um, obviously see everything that I'm doing online at my website at jeremywhittley.com. And then you can catch me on my podcast as well. I do a podcast every week called Progressively Horrified that I do with a couple of my fellow comic making friends, where every week we watch a scary movie and we talk about it through a political lens, trying to find ways in which horror movies are and aren't progressive and do or don't have interesting things to say.
Awesome. What about social media? If somebody wants to reach out with a question, where's the best place?
I think these days the best place is probably Blue Sky, where I am just at Jeremy Whitley. I am also on Tumblr at Jeremy Whitley, and then I'm on Twitter and Instagram at JRome58, so that's JROME 58. But I'm doing my best to try and stay off of Twitter because it's not a particularly healthy place to be these days.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that. So, okay, I'll put a link to Jeremy's website and his Blue Sky in the show notes as well, everybody. So if you're having trouble finding him, you can go and click there. And yeah, highly encourage you to track him down at one of those shows if you're going to be there, Baltimore or New York, or I'm sure if you give him a follow, you'll know where he's going to be showing up next. Yeah, again, highly recommend picking up Navigating with You. Very much worth your time. And if you have a young reader, a young, you know, preteen or teen, male or female, I really encourage you to pick this up and read it with them, share it with them. I can't wait to, you know, my daughter and I have already had some really great conversations about this book, and I look forward to having more with her when we get a little bit more time. But that's one of the things that's great about books like this. They engender conversations that you can have with the young people in your lives. So again, Jeremy, best of luck. Hopefully the book does really, really well. It's absolutely fantastic. So thanks for writing it, and thanks for taking the time to come on and talk about it.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
And to all you listeners, I want to thank you for taking the time as well, whether you're checking us out on YouTube or on the audio-only podcast feed. We really appreciate it, and we'll talk to you next time.